All right, thank you everyone for tuning in to the first episode of In Pursuit of Peace podcast. So this podcast is very special to my heart because when we start to do something like this, it is often a journey into the unknown and often a journey into eternity, because peace is something that we must never take for granted and must always be maintained and thought about throughout generations. So we don't know where this podcast will go, but here is the start. First of all, BeatsUnion is a pioneering digital union for the arts and an institution for the arts. We're trying to establish such big statements. But one big part of BeatsUnion is mobilizing artists for peace. And that's not a simple task. And in order to avoid different narratives of truth and what peace looks like, and because the world of definitions can have a contentious part to it, where different definitions can come and conflict with each other, and we can't find a footing. And this is where we find that there is a rare opportunity in what is called the World Peace Councils. They are essentially writers of history from a non-partisan narrative, giving us an objective view on the thing, and allowing us to also connect with knowledge keepers throughout history. So a part of our ambition with BeatsUnion technology is to connect artists to knowledge keepers, and in turn, inspired artists with truthful and meaningful knowledge will then inspire the world. And art is indeed powerful, and we believe in it, and we believe in coupling it with technology to make the impact that we seek. And so as we get these models ready in the technology itself, we thought it would be a good idea to begin our path with these podcasts to introduce you to different faces, to different artists, and couple an artist with also a representative from a peace council around the world. So today, I have with me Ed Lehman from the Canadian Peace Congress and the Regina Peace Council. Ed, if you don't mind just giving a quick introduction about yourself, and we'll move to Eric after. But I'd like us to today think about our answers and provide them to the idea of the universal human being, right? Not speak so much from a local perspective. We need to assume that somebody doesn't know much about our circumstances, our localities. And the only way we can find these places is if we focus on meaningful things, universally meaningful ideas, eternally meaningful ideas. So if you don't mind keeping that in perspective when we're trying to discuss the different subjects. So please, Ed, a quick introduction to people who don't know who you are.
Okay, my name, as Noor said, is Ed Lehman, and I'm the president of the Regina Peace Council and an executive member of the Canadian Peace Congress, which in turn is affiliated with the World Peace Council. All these different organizations were formed shortly after the end of World War II in around 1948, 1949, 1950, because people at that time were thinking of all the devastation that had been wrought by World War II and all the deaths that had occurred. And they were saying this cannot be allowed to ever happen again. So in Regina, across Canada and across the world, there was attempts which were successful to build up peace organizations in the different geographical areas that I mentioned, and as well as focusing on peace, the questions of social justice were also highlighted, and the people belonging to these organizations to this day believe that peace is necessary not just for its own sake, but it frees up the resources needed so people can have a good life, so their children can be educated, so that everyone can have the nourishment their bodies need. and so that all their needs will be met. And in different countries around the world, sometimes there's people who are very well off who are part of the peace movement, but very often it includes the poorest people in different countries who, even though they may be facing very harsh circumstances in their daily living, know that peace is something that's worth striving for, and that the achievement of peace can be used to better life overall.
Awesome. Thank you, Ed. Also with us today is my good friend, my good man, very talented Eric Gabriel, aka Archangel, a poet and an artist that I have the honor to have met and worked with most recently. Eric, please just a quick introduction of who you are.
It's interesting that whenever I hear that question, right, it's hard to answer because the go-to response are labels, you know. I am this, I am that, you know, but who are we really, you know? So I'm going off tangent, but that's that question always throws me in that angle. But as for what I do, I am, like you said, I'm an artist. I'm a performer, a performing artist. I'm also a writer. I have a collection of short stories out there titled Isles. I've written short films. I'm a performing artist, bro. But today, I would say what I identify as the most is a human being. I am a human being, and not just any human being. I'm a human being that is desperately seeking for world peace. You know, and I do believe that we all have our roles to play in achieving that.
Yeah, I agree. So thanks for the quick introduction, guys. The topic today at hand is to discuss the individual and the role of the individual in society. Things that we don't think often about is that we are, wherever we are situated in the world, if it's a country, if it's at a smaller scale, a company, if you work for a company, whatever you are and whatever, you look around you and recognize the type of collective that you're within. And these two things are usually very related, the individual and the collective, society per se, right? But behind that is humanity itself. It's almost like humanity is something that we often take for granted. It's something that we often think that it should be automatic, because I believe we were all children once. We come from that type of purity. And those of us who maintain their humanity per se, have not lost their innocence. You know, many people say that losing innocence, it's a part of the harsh realities of life. But I believe that that's not a requirement per se, you know, hopefully. So you're right. Well, I mean, we can start talking about this common humanity. I think, Ed, you have some years on us. Do you remember a time in history where people felt more alike than per se now, that people were more rooted into seeing each other as human beings and not so much what divides us, what differentiates us with?
Okay. I started really observing the world when I was a teenager. And I can remember being about 17, and at that time the war in Vietnam was raging. And initially, I was one of those people, like many other people across North America, who was agreeing with the United States, because we had been sold this bill of goods that the United States is a great defender of democracy. And I didn't have anyone initially to tell me any different. But I was very, very lucky. In high school, I encountered friends who had a different view of the world. And they explained to me, no, Ed, the U.S. is not in Vietnam because of democracy. The U.S. is in Vietnam because Vietnam has very rich resources. And the United States wants to take those resources. And they don't care about the question of democracy. They're prepared to ally themselves with dictatorships when it's convenient for their corporate interests. So it was from that time I started looking, and later when I became a teacher and I was teaching history, I would tell my students, if you want to understand what's going on, follow the money. Look to where the money is going. Try to understand who is gaining, who is becoming rich, how are they becoming rich. Then we can begin to understand history as it's being made in front of our very eyes. So one of the pictures that still sticks in my mind from the war in Vietnam was there was a very young girl who was running. She had been set on fire. And she was running and she was burning. She lived. And actually later, many years later, she was able to move to Canada. The U.S. did not care how many people they were injuring. Over 3 million people in Vietnam died defending their country. You know, and we have to recognize that the Americans were invaders of Vietnam. If they were defending their own country, that's something they would be doing at home if someone was attacking them. But they weren't in their home. They were in somebody else's home and forcing them to defend their country. And my wife and I, a couple years ago, went to Vietnam, and I was surprised because if someone came into my house and was killing everyone and killed members of my family, I would be bitter. But the people of Vietnam aren't bitter. And not that they've forgotten what had happened, but they want to be friends with everyone in the world. And they're really focused now on rebuilding their country and have done a lot of work in that regard.
If you don't mind me asking, like he said, as a knowledge keeper, I consider myself a knowledge seeker. I don't have any knowledge to keep yet. I'm too young for that. But do you think, because you mentioned something that I find quite interesting. You said, despite what the Americans did to the Vietnamese, they don't harbor any hate, right? Just that's also the case like back home, right? Despite what colonialism did to us, we don't harbor any hate towards white people, right?
Yeah.
Like you and what I've heard, like most Western Europeans always say, oh, if it was them, they will retaliate this and all of that. And now I'm thinking, do you think it's a cultural thing? And I'm coming back to the issue about individualism, which you mentioned earlier. My culture is based on communalism, where the community, right, is we even though we are individual members, we each have our place in the community, and when we're doing well, the community becomes stronger. So the village, the old proverb that says it takes a village to raise a child comes from that kind of ideology, right?
Yeah.
Where in communalism we appreciate humanity, we appreciate the other person's life of the other person, right? We won't just come into your home and raid you because we understand that, oh, you are a human being, and that territory, you have sovereignty over that territory, right? But do you think that's lacking in the West? I mean, because of that lack is what is spiraling out of control, is what we're seeing today.
I think that many countries, their way of life is to work together as friends, you could say. And it's not individualistic. They have traits of individuals, but not in a selfish way. And it's something, sometimes it's hard for us from the West to understand that kind of viewpoint unless, like, we go and we meet with indigenous people in North America. They often retain that kind of working for everyone in the community attitude as a way of life. We are led to believe in Western society that the individual, as an individual who only thinks of himself, is the greatest thing going. So we're taught we should worship an Elon Musk or a Donald Trump because look what great individuals they are, without looking at what values are they representing. And of course there are, you know, some wealthy people and some people in power who reflect different values other than selfishness and consumerism. But right now in North America, that seems to be the values that are predominating. And it's hard to escape them because they're all pervasive. They're surrounding us all the time. But I myself, I believe that human beings are good.
Yeah.
And I believe that most people, if given a choice, will do the right thing. But they have to know what is that right thing.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that. Sorry that when my brain works, it's one thought leads to another, and just now having that individualistic mentality. But actually, is it really individualistic or more of selfishness? Because you can't have an individualistic mentality without being selfish, right? But then this selfishness might be what is also preventing peace. Because now, if I'm all about me and you're all about you, you know, when we come to the table of negotiation, how then can we actually find peace when I want what's best for me and you want what's best, and not what's best for both of us? You know?
Yeah. One thing we have to learn is that when it comes to economics, war is very economical for a very small number of people. A very small number of people own the war industries. The average person in the US and Canada don't benefit economically from war. In fact, they are the ones who will pay the lion's share to have a growing military that causes war. And if we take the resources, for example, that go to a military budget and we siphon off, let's say half of that, and we put half of that money that's now going into a war budget and we put it into education and healthcare, there would be an awful lot more jobs created than are created in the military. But of course, we're always told Canada is not putting its share into the military that it should be. We put, I think it's 1.7% of our GDP is going to the military. There was talk that it should be boosted to 2% or 2.5%. Of course, Trump now is saying countries like Canada are not paying their fair share. But since when did he become the Prime Minister of Canada? to be influencing all of this. But he says Canada should be paying at least 5%.
Yeah.
Okay, and how many people would be going hungry as a result of this change of allocation of funds?
Maybe that's the
Well,
point. So
and maybe that's the point, because him and his buddy Elon like to see people suffer. You know.
well, maybe that's the point, because if you're looking for to live with dignity, or you're looking for some income, or you're looking for food, or maybe you'd be willing to go to war to save your family, etc. So these things, I believe, are related. But going back, Eric, to the question you asked, brother, I feel like every nation has its own history and its own predicament. And I come from the Middle East, and our nations, how we grew up thinking, per se, right, are very much influenced by our common history, because we have a religious element to our common history. We've never had unity amongst countries in that region without our common history. There is an element of our localized history, right? Like, I'm from Syria, so there's an element of all the things that Syria has been throughout history. But essentially, it is the religious movements, and commonly what we call, the Islamic rising at the beginning, and that is what gave unity to the whole region, and everybody started speaking the same language, and etc. But it comes down to principle, and it comes down to common principle and common values, because we grow up with these inherited values within our families. The Middle East is influenced by every power that ever existed throughout history, whether regional. So let's say, you had the Egyptian Empire, you had the Persian Empire, you had the Babylonian. So all of these influenced it, but also influenced by, Genghis Khan when it was raised, or the Roman Empire. And so because of that, we almost lost what makes us from people, common people, indigenous people, in the way that we reside on this land and we cultivate it, and we want to be able to provide a good future for our children. This is the birth of the common ideology, seeking meaning past our difference of colors and past our different of shit. Because you see people in the Middle East that look from Asia, right? And I mean, we are Asian personally, but I'm saying, with the eyes, or we have people who are your skin color, right? We have all this mix. And so the idea of the universal, sublime meaning of life, and these are the things that we were able to surpass all that differentiates us and put us together commonly. So we grew up learning about the value of selflessness. We grew up, we were talking about compassion at one point. The question is compassion rooted in the self? A lot of people say self-love these days, right? You gotta love yourself, self-love. But is love coming from the self? And if it's, or is there more love and compassion in selflessness? And if it's not coming from the self, then how are you loving yourself? These things we contemplated throughout history. So for us, it's more like, no, love is eternal, and it comes from beyond. It comes from the Creator. It comes from whatever. So we seek to receive love rather than, So different ideology, different how we think, all of it. But move forward to the West, right? What's the history of the society? How they were able to culminate? So religious history teaches about bringing a power structure from the bottom up, right? From the people to the people. At least that's how it starts. Later on, it turns into an empire and a corrupt institution, sadly. But in contrast, we have power structure that is a top-bottom power structure. And I believe that this is where the issue is, because when we're talking about individualism, it's a different definition altogether from what you would get in Canada versus what we'd see. Like, I'm a guy who lived half my life in the Middle East and grew up in community, and I loved that. But also, after living in Canada for so many years, I used to feel very lonely, and I struggled with the ideas of individuality here. But I also grew to appreciate it at a certain point, because if you're not truly an individual, how are you seeing past the group mentality as well? So there's value there, and I believe that you can never have a strong collective without a strong individual as well. But it comes down to definition. So my question is, what is peace? And is peace very subjective in its nature, right? I mean, let's think about a situation where slavery is predominant. What is peace then? Because we know from history and its lessons that at some point, slaves that want to rebel against the master for a better life, for better condition, etc., might also find resistance from other slaves, because other slaves might want the peace under the supremacy of the master. They say, you're disturbing the peace. So we got to come down to an agreement to what is peace and its relationship to justice, right? And from there also kind of find a way to connect that to the individual and how we think and to define these things, because without common definitions, we are going to always be lost, right? And so for peace today, my question to both of you really is, how do you view peace, and from what angle are we going to look for peace, and how it's relation to social justice? Because to me is, when we don't have justice, we will always have resistance. And we will always have war. And a class system, essentially that's when they clash, it's war. So justice is very important, and we must also uphold it. And I think that's what we're kind of seeking maybe, right? But to you, both of you, your view of peace in society or the world and its relationship to justice too.
Well, I mentioned the World Peace Council does link the fight for peace with the fight for social justice. So while the World Peace Council has been focused on the question of stopping nuclear war, for example, the World Peace Council was a consistent supporter of the African National Congress in its fight against apartheid in South Africa. And the World Peace Council has been consistent in its support of the people who are living in colonies in their fight against imperialism, including U.S. imperialism, and now we have Canadian imperialism, or cases where Canada is backing up the United States, or in its own name acting as imperialist country and has some rather big investments in some of the so-called third world countries. I want to take to go back a page in Canadian history and recognize that this country was built by working people who were working together, including in factories, and also farming people. And this province, for example, at the turn of the 20th century, in 1900, already had about 1 million people. Around the same population, though just a little less than we have today, but most people at that time were living on farms. And farming was a tough business because they had to buy everything from the East. They had to buy their machinery they needed from the East. The markets in the East determined whether they would make any money off of their farming or not. And they learned very quickly once they became farmers, and that's part of my family roots in this province, they learned they had to work together. And they were very generous to each other as farmers, and I believe we still have that carry over in our thinking to this day of looking out, whether we're working on a farm or working in a factory or working on a job where there's a group of people, we look out. There's a sense of solidarity with the other workers. And I found, as a young person, you don't have to be on a job very long before the elders on the job teach you values of solidarity.
With your coworkers.
With your coworkers.
It's true.
And I can give a very small example. I was working for a company called Federal Pioneer, and it was winter time, and everybody had been getting stuck because of the snow for about a week. So that day, the union guys, the key union guys said, we're not going to work today. We all went home. We told the employer, we're not going to be shoveling, trying to get in here anymore. You have to clear that snow. So we're going home today.
And you stood for your ground, yeah.
We went home. It didn't take a company very long. We had snow plows there with trucks. Everything was clear.
Yeah.
That settled the question. It wasn't legal for us to do. We had a contract. What we did.
Yeah. Power, because there's power in coming together.
Because we did it as a unit.
That's right.
There was no retribution, no bad feelings. The company actually recognized that we were right.
Yeah, so per se, we can say if justice goes way off the charts, then it creates the bad conditions for more people, and there's more opportunity for coming together to make a stance, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the relationship with maintaining the peace. But if it's kind of just conditions, then people will remain peaceful per se without coming together.
Yeah, so there's peace in different situations. Of course, the challenge today is not to have nuclear war. Why I'm emphasizing that so much is there can be no winner. Leaders in the West like to think in their mind that they could kill every person in Russia. And they could kill every person in China, and somehow everybody over here would be okay. Well, I don't know what they've been smoking, but it's the wrong stuff.
It's the truth, man. It's the truth. Yeah.
You know, so we don't have to like the Russians. We don't have to like the Chinese. We don't have to like the Africans. But we have to coexist with them because there's only one world.
We don't have to agree per se, not like.
We don't have to agree with them.
Right.
But there's only one world. And we have to share that world.
Yeah.
Because it's our common house.
Yeah, but you know, it's like if I think we focus on this idea of like everybody was a child once, I see you, brother, because even if you're born in Nigeria, but I see the child within you, I see the child within me, and we say, we're still human beings. I'm interested to learn about your experience. You can interested to learn about my experience, and at least that creates the common ground. It's people who lose perspective of their, per se, the innocent childhood part that they kind of unable to see the other person at that level, right? Sometimes the harshness of life kind of takes over.
I was thinking of the idea of supremacy, right? Because you said something about we don't have to agree, we don't have to like, we don't have to, and I want to say, stick back down to the idea of communalism, how that idea transcends skin color. Which I think communalism further entrenches the idea of humanism. So when the Dutch guy got marooned in South Africa, South Africa is in this cannibals, as the West would say, right? These savages. Not say, oh, hey, who are these? Because obviously they don't look like us, right? Let's eat them. They'll make a good snack. No. I took care of them with their innate, mind you, when you get marooned, you don't have no medicine or nothing, right? So they got saved and nourished back to life with some local herbs, right? The same herbs that these Western powers call unworthy of being used to human beings. We feel it. Now, they got nourished back to life, because they helped them use the ships back, right? Put them back on their boats with food, natural resources, right?
They shared knowledge and resources.
Knowledge and resources. They shared it.
Yeah.
They didn't say, oh, we are superior to you even though you're on our land. No. I'm going somewhere now, right? That's on one angle. On the present day Ghana, formerly known as Gold Coast, one European explorer wrote back home and said the Ghanaian people waste their resources because they give out gold, they share gold in their community for free. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
they had no reason to say, this gold, I will hoard it from you unless you pay me this amount. No. My brother, welcome to my house, take some gold, you know?
They didn't think of it like that.
Because of what I want to talk about, like, we are individuals, but we are in this community together. I am. The famous phrase we go to, I am because we are. I am because you are.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So that mentality is what I find lacking heavily here. And you are talking about a union. And you are right. I think the closest idea to communalism I have seen since I've moved to the West is in unions, right? But it ends there, in the union, right? Now, when you come out of the workplace into everyday life, right? The Caucasian co-worker in the union would not come out and, stand up for the black fellow outside and fellow in the union outside. That solidarity and camaraderie it's them versus the organization, right? But it's beyond that. We're talking about life now, right? When they go out of that.
You're talking about a common culture outside companies and outside,
that's what
yes. Yes. Because I think it's an individual money. You'll find quite a bit of people who will do the right thing, transcend colors, etc. I don't think that's an issue. But I think you're right. It's in the lack of common culture outside the companies. And it works both ways. In the lack of common culture outside the companies become the culture. So you'll find a lot of people where they work is their life entirely, and their culture, how they speak and how they act. And outside of that, there's definitely, and maybe something to say about the value of art to creating culture, to creating a common culture, etc. But my question to you, brother, is in Africa, right? Prior to colonization, you also probably, just like anywhere else in the world, you had tribalism, but you had your own civilizations that transcended tribalism as well throughout history, right? So I'd like, that'll be an interesting conversation to learn a little bit about how that formed in Africa.
So it's funny how, words are very, I find words a very, very interesting part of life, So the French wouldn't say that they had a French tribe. They would say they had a French empire.
Yeah.
But tribes are usually used when it comes to
non-European. It's true.
Yeah.
I mean, I speak from the Middle East. We have a lot of tribes, and they're usually related to families, right? Yeah.
You know what I mean? But we didn't have. We had empires. For example, I'm from Edo State, which is like an offshoot of the Great Benin Empire.
So you had empires also.
Yes. Matter of fact, when the Portuguese, because people forget the British weren't the first to come to Africa. The Portuguese were the first. And when they came, and that is why, the Portuguese didn't come to establish slavery. They came for trade, They came, they saw we had ivory, they traded gold and all of that. It's the British that came and said, man, fuck this trade.
How far away did the empire that you mentioned stretch out? Did it reach outside of Africa as well?
Like my
like you mentioned an empire.
Empire?
Yeah. So did that reach outside of Africa? Or just within Africa?
I would say within Africa.
Within Africa.
Right? Although the Great Malian Empire had an emperor who was more focused on exploring. Right? And so some people trace his explorations to North America, talking about how, because the Olmecs had like African features, dark skin, flat nose, and all of that, right? So they say maybe his expeditions ended up there, but it's all here, so only God knows the truth. But I would say these empires, right, even though, and I'm going back to this again, right, the issue of slavery. Because when I meet my brothers, my Black American brothers, they always say, you sold us to slavery. Oh, wow, I'm sorry. You obviously don't know your history. It's okay. So I take my time to at least try and, impart some knowledge.
Yeah.
The word slave did not mean what it is to us. That's what it is to the British people. Because when we had, because I would be a liar if I say, oh, it was all peaceful, there were no wars. No. Conflict is a thing with human nature, right? But when we conquer slaves and bring them back, right, you're just in a lower strata of the
So
society.
a servant, per se, a place in the class system, or
In the class system, you're at the bottom.
Yeah.
But you have your own land to farm. You can marry, you can have a family, you know what I mean?
So even the word had a different definition, a different
Exactly.
idea.
So when they came and said, we're going to take some of these people as slaves, what we had in our mind was not in chains, shackles, or whips and being forced to labor and also, live like an animal. No. Slaves in our culture were treated as human beings, which I bring back to the idea of humanism, communalism. You are still a human being, even though you're at the bottom of the strata.
Yeah.
You still should be accorded the dignity of a human being. That is what's missing.
Yeah, fast forward to the idea of human rights. That's the idea behind human rights, I guess, is that, we can recognize everybody's a human being. When I first moved to Canada 25 years ago, with all its problems, but there was still a more prominent feel for human rights than it is now. It was the culture. It was a part of the culture. And you can see it also because everybody was able to speak. We can see also that the indigenous people were able to find more organization under the premise of human rights as well, right? Within the system per se, rather than going clash with the system. And the people also accepted after learning the history and wanted to support their movements. And we see them today, they're quite organized and hopefully better in the future because, if we're in Canada, they are Canada. They are the roots of Canada, right? The oldest roots. But I feel like today we're getting to a place where human rights are also kind of losing their values. I wanted to ask you though, tell me about European tribes, because you must have had European tribes. There was European tribes. Gypsies, you told me once, were eradicated. Gypsies are kind of European tribes too, right? I mean, tribes all around the world, gypsies, but...
Well, of course. But it depends who's telling the story. Because people who came from empires think in terms of superiority. So, what was World War I and World War II all about? Different tribes were fighting who could emerge on top. And after World War I, the victors decided the Germans would pay reparations. Well, that led to World War II. And it's like today, if somehow the U.S. got put down and the other countries would say, well, you're going to have to pay X amount of dollars, people from the U.S. would fight that quite strongly. I think the values also depend on what is the economics of a country. So Canada, most people in Canada for a long, long time lived by being farmers or working on farms. And they had more of a collectivist mentality. That changed as the years went by. Like now, maybe there's 3% farming in Canada. That's a very, very small percentage. And it's getting so the percentage working in factories is small as well. A lot of people work in service industries now, and they don't know, even though they may be beneficiaries of struggles of years past, they don't know their own history as a worker or as a farmer because it is not taught to them in school. In school, we're taught the corporate history. So I can remember in school learning about captains of industry, and we would have essays to read about these captains of industry, and they were portrayed as the most wonderful people ever. And I didn't know at that time how some of them were terribly exploiting the workers who worked in their factories. Because as a capitalist country, Canada's education system is serving the big corporations. And oftentimes what we think is truth or not truth is influenced by the corporate media. You know, well, who is the media? The media are also big corporations who often will have investments in other sections of the media, including the sections of the monopolies that own the military industries.
Which begs, you know, the necessity for independent institutions for these areas of societies, like when we mentioned the media or the reporter. That's there's a certain honorable aspect of the profession itself, out of service, out of selflessness, out of sacrifice, right? And same thing with the Peace Council. You don't do it because there's money in it. You do it because it's a sense of sacrifice and it's a necessity, and you have to see it before you dedicate your life in that way. But there's something really important that you mentioned, and that is depends who you ask, or depends who's leading the conversation. And I feel like this is the value of knowledge, you know, because when we talk about tribalism, we're not necessarily talking about people with spears and small structures, or, you know, because we could look also at the World War and how different nations went to war with each other, similar to tribes. So it was a forms of tribalism, right? When we talk about the dangers of tribalism in the nation perspective, is how leaders were able to convince people to basically jump off of the edge, you know, go towards their own death. And that's because of group mentality and how powerful that can get, and the lack of the individual to have that critical thinking to overcome the group mentality. So tribalism is not necessarily just a small structure, and definitely not unique to just Africa, right? But rather it's a concept, it's an organizational structure. And I think when we focus on knowledge as a sublime area, and as a sublime truth and knowledge and meaningful knowledge, we can recognize that. Because then we could look at every company as a tribe. We could look at every collective potentially as a tribe, right? If certain principles are not upheld, and if certain dynamics are not upheld. And I feel like, okay, you know, what we're trying with BeatsUnion, for example, is the idea of a sovereign collective, that we can work together from a place where we can recognize the importance of the individual within a collective, seek to empower that. And the only way to do that is through knowledge, which is why we're doing these podcasts, is to share knowledge and to try to get closer to the idea. So I think this is a good entry point to talk about a little bit more focus on the individual part of thing and our responsibility. Because like when I first moved to Canada, the idea of individualism was not per se all about, you know, finding your, who you are and your identity, or no, it was more rather like there's also a connection to the system, the proposed system of democracy that we have, and how it's very important, the responsibility of the individual. And it's very important that you vote and you realize you're right and you realize all these aspects, right? So at what point did this ever work, Ed, like in Canada? Because, you know, we're talking strong individualism in Canada, and I don't want to enter the areas of liberalism yet because there's a history there about the ideas of individualism and liberalism. But did it ever work in terms of like there is a system of a collective and we can recognize each other as people who are educated, who are critical thinkers, and who are able to participate in a democracy to present or provide the right outcome per se, right? Did that ever exist in Canada?
Well, see, when we look at Canadian history, Canada was initially colonies that came together, that formed Canada.
A union of its own.
Well, Canada was French colonies and English colonies initially, and then the British were able to beat down the French and take the land that they had, which was Quebec, and part of Nova Scotia was held by France. So Britain came out on top of that, but there was a revolution in Canada, in Ontario and Quebec in about 1837. So people at that time did not feel there was democracy in either one. But the revolutions were put down, some of the revolutionaries were hung, and it held things down for quite a long time.
What year was this, you say?
1837.
Was there a Canada at 1837?
No, there were provinces, so. Well,
Okay.
it was before provinces, but colonies,
Okay.
you know. And so, things were, I mean, there was always conflict. And a lot of the conflict was based on class conflict between the very wealthy and the rest of the population. Down the road, of course, there was conflict between people in the West and people in the East because the owners of industry were in the East. So it was natural for people in the West to say, well, damn those people in the East. But actually, most of the people in the East were just like the people in the West, working for someone who had a little more money than what they had, or maybe a lot more money than they had. And things kind of rolled along without too much protest until the 30s.
1930s.
But 1929, the stock market crashed. And people were forced to struggle for even something to eat, let alone for unemployment insurance and other social benefits. And all those benefits we have today came from the struggles of the 1930s that were popularized then. And some of them weren't realized until much later, until some of them were realized in the 1960s and 70s. Some of the reforms in Canadian society. And now we can see in the US, there's a big struggle to get rid of a lot of the reforms that the US working people have won over the years. And that will be reflected, and is reflected in Canada too. So there's certain political forces in Canada who want to take away whatever rights the working class have.
So this is your Charter of Rights and Freedoms and etc., is it?
Well, that's a small element of it,
Yeah.
actually. But it would include things like the right to strike.
Interesting. So I think it's a good entry point for liberalism and neoliberalism in particular, because all these things didn't come out of thin air per se, right? The people struggled to bring these things to reality, and they're not fake. They were won over battles and probably some bloodshed along the way as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. For example, you may have heard about the Regina riot. Well, there was one policeman who was killed as a result of the Regina riot. But there was also one trekker, onto Ottawa trekker, who was killed. But that's not
Trucker. Trucker.
trekker. Like there was an onto Ottawa trek. Guys started in Vancouver in the work camps because they were sick of being in work camps. They were getting paid, I think, 20 cents a day. And they decided, to hell with this. We're going to take our grievances to Ottawa. And they rode the train, on the top of the train, and rode the boxcars to Ottawa to take their message.
So trekkers as in like...
Yeah,
As in,
yeah, they were on a cross-country trek,
okay, trek. Yeah.
to Ottawa.
Okay.
And it was out of those struggles of the 30s that we got a lot of the social programs that we have today. So none of those things were won because of liberalism or neoliberalism.
Or the definitions of individuality that came
but
through that, right?
I have my own definition of neoliberalism. I think neoliberalism is when there is no longer any controls on the capitalist class. And they can do to the workers what they want. That's the ultimate of neoliberalism.
Can you explain a little bit more?
Well, okay, as a society now in Canada, we're governed by laws, including in the workforce. And the employer can't treat the employees like cattle. Mm-hmm. There's certain rules. You know, if someone comes and you hire them to work here, you have to pay them at least minimum wage. You have to make sure that they're working under safe conditions, or you could be charged. Mm-hmm. With neoliberalism, those ideas go out the window.
So is neoliberalism...
Anything goes, don't you say?
Anything goes.
So is neoliberalism nihilism?
Well, it can become that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here's your answer, Eric, I guess, about the selfishness part of what we're talking about. Is people, I think, taking for granted the rights they've lived, they've taken peace for granted, and they've taken the rights that they've had for granted, and they grew, the word is very important, entitled to them. And I think the hard lesson that hopefully we don't find is that, that they have to learn that you're not entitled to any of these things, and what have you done to contribute to further these things forward, and that's a tough question, man. Like, how long have you been in Canada, Eric?
2 years.
2 years, huh? Okay. So for you, do you see a Canadian culture? Do you see liberalism? How do you see the individual and the relationship to liberalism to you? Because when I spoke to you, you recognized the term neoliberalism as well, and you had a view that capitalism is moving towards neoliberalism as a synonym.
That's where, because, societal ideologies change our generation, right? And I feel capitalism will be capitalism forever. It's always going to metamorphosize into something. And then I and a friend were having a conversation. I'm like, what do you think? Like, I'm seeing the word tending towards liberalism, but I'm thinking it should be a more neoliberalism kind of idea. Whereby, and like you said, right, the wealthy have so much power, right? And I don't even see, and for that to happen, right, which by the way, these are all hypotheses, right? I see what would give them that power to do whatever they want is companies now are the new government. Like, to hell with political bodies, like these capitalist organizations, Apple, Amazon, or whatever huge company, they now become governments. They now say, okay, because mind you, for Nigeria, I know that happened, and when I took a class here, and I realized that was what happened, I think, was it HBC, that company that was the British side, was it HBC they were called?
Yeah, that's a big company.
That's the main company. In Nigeria was a Royal Niger company that later metamorphosized into the Level company, and today Unilever. They're still there. So the companies were the ones running an entire country before before the British Empire said, no, we'll buy this land from you, right?
Yeah.
So it might revert back to that, whereby, you know, for example, Apple says, you know, they have the entire East Coast, you know, and maybe Facebook Meta says, oh yeah, we'll keep the West, right?
Yeah.
And then everyone is under their rulership, so then they can do whatever they want to do.
Yeah, so I see it a little differently. I see on the one hand, we're moving towards fascism, and where small groups can get into the government and, like Trump, end up turning a society into a fascist society.